We're dropping this episode of No Filter on Mother's Day. It's a day when mums everywhere will be enjoying breakfast in bed, lunch with their kids, they'll be opening cards and presents and celebrating the very unique bond between a mother and her children. Except there are many, many people who won't be celebrating today because they've lost their mother, or they're estranged from their mother, or they've lost their child, or they never got to be a mother in the first place. We're dropping this episode today for all those people who aren't feeling so happy on Mother's Day. You're not alone. There are normal phone calls, and then there are the ones that change your life forever. The phone calls that come in the middle of the night, or phone calls from hospitals, phone calls that come from relatives who have news, usually bad news, that they need to tell you. Chances are you've probably received one of these phone calls, and you know that sinking feeling that forms in the pit of your stomach and makes it feel like the world's opened up and swallowed you whole. And yet, somehow, the world unfairly, inexplicably, remains the same to everyone who's not inside your bubble. Sarah Ferguson is someone I've interviewed before on No Filter. She's a friend. And I've interviewed her under very different circumstances from the ones that brought us together for this conversation today. Sarah is an award-winning journalist, author, mother, wife, and daughter. And this story begins with a phone call with her brother that Sarah had in the back of a taxi last year when he told her that their mother had very suddenly and very unexpectedly died.
It was the most extraordinary moment because I've spent my whole life being drilled and trained, not now, but my whole upbringing was about restraint. And it all collapsed, broke down, the temple was rent in twain, everything did go to hell in that moment, and I was writhing in the back of the taxi and Tony was trying to hold me together.
I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to the No Filter podcast. Real stories you won't be able to stop listening to. Sarah Ferguson is this week facing her first Mother's Day without her mum, Marjorie. She's written a book called On Mother that captures the days, weeks and months after her beloved mother's death in the most poignant, beautiful way. This was one of the first interviews Sarah had done about losing her mum, Marjorie. And even though this is a cliche that a journalist like Sarah would heartily disapprove of, I think that the daughter in her will understand and give me permission to say that our conversation made us laugh and cry. And I don't think I've ever cried during an episode of No Filter, and we've done hundreds. But this one had us both reaching for the tissues. Here's Sarah Ferguson. Before the book even starts and throughout it, you're so good at articulating the poignant guilt felt by a child who chooses to move to another country and away from their parents, particularly when their parents become old. How did that sort of unfold for you?
It unfolded by thinking about her having lived far away from her own parents and understanding, and why does it take us so long to figure out the things that are glaringly obvious and in front of us? So I listen to other people, my friends, talking about their parents, and some of their mothers are, they're reproachful. They say they should be doing more, they should see them more often, all those sorts of things, or they follow them across the world. And my mother never reproached me for anything ever except being a bit of a grub. No reproach, no suggestion that I had in any way left her. And I started thinking about her because she was separated from her own parents by eloping, but it took a very long time before they came back together again. So she did understand, but in spite of that, she never used any of those feelings. She never passed them on to me. So I lived an entirely guilt-free existence. It would poke at me, but it was a guilt-free existence because she never raised it, and then she died. And all I could think about was the times I hadn't called, the times I hadn't written. I had a copy of my husband's book sitting on the back shelf of our car. No, not the book. I had the envelope. I'd managed to buy the envelope, which is, I thought, quite a big achievement. I'd bought the envelope, but of course I hadn't been back to the post office to send it. Now, this is not a monumental regret. People have proper big regrets, but it was just a perfect little indication of my million failures. And yet she's so nice, she never made me feel it.
at the time the book opens, your own sons are at the point of flying the nest, Cosmo and Lucien. Was there a certain realisation of how your mother must feel when they got to that age where they started to pull away from you?
Yes, and you realise, of course, that young people have no... Well, we sort of know that while they're wonderful, they live in bubbles. They don't have a fully rounded sense of their relationships to older people and what it is to be older. Of course they don't. They haven't. You'd have to have extraordinary insight to get that at that age. And I very quickly began looking at them as my mother looked at me, and all of those instincts to say, no, not to burden them with those feelings. So It begins in the instance, the king is dead, long live the king. You know, in that very moment, there was one little scene where they had sheepishly, I'm jumping ahead, but they'd sheepishly asked if they were allowed to play tennis while we were there. And I sort of thought about it for a second and thought...
This is after she died.
After she died, the village would be shocked, but she would like it. So she would love the sound of them playing tennis, so that was fine. But I went to watch them, and I did have a moment of almost envy of the freedom that they hadn't... These big things were things they had yet to experience. And I was trying to make them understand. They're moved by our grief, of course, but without fully understanding it. And I had a little tiny moment of, that is not your lot yet.
You hear about her death in a text message. Well, not in a text message. You receive a message from your brother, a WhatsApp message before you and your husband Tony get on a plane from Melbourne to Sydney. Now, it said, call me immediately, Tar. And you said that the mix of urgency and sort of forced casualness about that, you decided to not reply until you landed and were in Sydney and were actually in the back of a taxi.
Yeah.
Did it not occur to you that it might be bad news?
Yes, it did, because exactly as you observed that the odd mixture of language, call me urgently, Tar, there was a growing sense that this wasn't good. But I thought, if the plane is about to take off, you can't have that conversation, whatever it is now. And it can't be that bad, surely, because you would know, somehow or other you would know. There'd be some other means by which you would know. But it won't be something good, so wait until you land. Don't sit on a plane with that when you're out of contact. So I put it aside and just stared at the clouds. So it wasn't until I got into the back of the taxi that and we had left the airport that I decided to ring him.
On that plane trip, what were the different scenarios playing through your mind?
I don't know quite how I did this, but I didn't play out the scenarios because I think the dread, that little boulder of dread sitting in the pit of my stomach, was so grey or so nearly black that I didn't, because, I think that you can allow yourself to do that if you think it's going to be okay. But I think I had a sense that something was wrong, and so I just let the black boulder sit and I didn't play out the scenarios.
You waited until you were about in the back of a taxi. That seems like a bad idea.
That seems like a terrible idea. But what's worse, sort of screaming in the terminal, or because I was still telling myself, notwithstanding that pit of the stomach feeling, that it couldn't be the worst thing because somehow the heavens would have been rent in twain, or there would have been some lightning or something. The ground would have shaken. Something would have happened, so it couldn't be that. So I thought I was safe to call him in the taxi, but I probably knew that I wasn't. But there you go, I couldn't wait any longer.
And how did that phone call play out?
It was the most extraordinary moment, because I've spent my whole life being drilled and trained, not now, but my whole upbringing was about restraint, that you don't make things about yourself, that you don't make a racket, that you show dignity and restraint in all moments, and you don't push yourself and your own experiences or sadnesses forward. It's sort of the opposite of the Shia woman, wailing in grief. That's one way of dealing with grief, and the English way of dealing with grief is by finding the deepest dignity that you possibly can.
Being stoic.
A life of taught where stoicism is essential. And it all collapsed, broke down, the temple was rent in twain, everything did go to hell in that moment, and I was writhing in the back of the taxi, and Tony was trying to hold me together, and I wouldn't let him hold me together, and this wonderfully dignified taxi driver just lowered his head and kept driving. I just had a wonderful thing where each of these awful moments was accompanied by a very dignified taxi driver from another country who understood and behaved with perfect delicacy. So, even in that moment, so this is an interesting thing, that in that moment, Anthony sort of blurted
This
it
is your
out.
brother, so
This is
you
my brother,
called
him, but he was driving. He was on holiday, and he was driving through, you know, those tunnels through the Alps that go and go and go. So the line dropped out, and in that moment when the first line dropped out, I had to make myself think about him and not me. So imagine what it's like for him. He's in the middle of the night in Italy. He's got this call. He's learnt the same thing, and he has to tell me. So just hold on thinking about yourself for a minute and drag yourself to think about him. So the first thing I said to him was, I'm sorry you had to make this call, because what a position to find himself in. And it's interesting, just that act of, just for a second, because I went back to writhing, but for a second to make yourself not think about yourself helps.
Yeah, I was really struck by the juxtaposition of you writhing about in the taxi, Tony trying to hold you and support you, and then you saying, I'm really sorry that you had to, thinking about your brother. Your mother would have been proud of that in terms of stoicism and just trying to hold it together.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't holding it together because I was making, you know, I think I described them as animal noises. You know, something really big broke down in that moment.
Now, you're an investigative journalist, so the first thing I wanted to know and would have expected you to ask was what happened. But it seemed like in the telling of the story, you didn't even find that out until much later.
Much later. But in that moment, given where he was, and he actually said he didn't know that much, the salient point in that moment, the thing that was so heartbreaking in that moment that I'm sure you and anybody with a mother would understand, even if it's a difficult relationship, is that she was alone. She was in
he communicated that she'd been in hospital.
And he didn't know she was in hospital. I didn't know she was in hospital. So that vision of her, this sweet, gentle creature, dying without anybody by her side in the rough mechanical way in which people die in hospitals, and as hospitals must move on and move them on, and I know all about that. I've been in hospitals filming when people die. You know, hospitals are about the living, not the dead. And while there is some delicacy, you know, all of the momentum is to move on to the living. Just the thought of that sweet, gentle creature by herself, I remember howling, you know, no, that's so wrong. Of all the people in the world, not to have a gentle end. She should have been one of those people who had someone kissing her forehead and holding her hand and telling her it was time to go.
Which is what she did for your father.
Which is what
and you and your brother did for your father.
Yes, so we had the contrast of a death that was gentle and
at home.
And at home, if any, you know, dying at home compared to a hospital, it's all the difference in the world, and a gentle letting go. No, you know, it's nothing easy about people dying, but it was gentle. And this, I knew in that instant, was anything but gentle. It was rough, it was mechanical, and there was nobody there.
How many years before had Marjorie lost her husband?
It was quite a long time, and somebody said to me afterwards, you know, so how old was she when your father died? And I realised she was 67. You know, for me, she was 167. Once again, I don't understand this absence of curiosity of the child, which, given that curiosity is the driving force of everything I'm supposed to do in relation to her, I didn't seem to have any. So, and it was only in that moment that I understood that she was only 67. So it was about maybe 13 years or so. And she said to me some years later that she, after we'd all left, you know, that awful moment after the funeral, she walked into the back garden and said, right, you're on your own now. Time to begin again. You know, she just gave herself a talking to and began again and never complained. Never once. You know, it's not that she's a mouse. She just doesn't feel that it's her job didn't feel it was her job to make other people feel bad about her circumstances. She got busy and got on with it.
It's funny you just slipped into present tense. Does that still happen?
So one of the loveliest things that a friend of mine, you know, people say terrible things. There are people who just don't get it.
What are the terrible things?
Not terrible,
just
but
so I don't say them in the
future. You know, well, how old was she? Oh, well, that's okay then. You know,
she had a good run.
She had a good run, good innings, all of that.
She was 80 when she died.
Well, she was 80 when she died. So that's not. Oh, well, that's okay then, isn't it? Which is a sort of complete misunderstanding of what's going on. It's those people, all the ones who say, my mother just died. Oh, yeah, when that happened to me, those people. So there's I can't hear anybody else's story without thinking about myself people, or they've had a good run response. So anybody hears that, remember never to say that. I actually haven't talked about it like this since I wrote it. it's actually, I said before, there's nothing you can't ask me, but I'm having a right old churn on this side of the table.
I'm feeling quite teary as well, for what it's worth.
So I'll just tell you about the voice. So somebody said the conversation continues. And at the time, I thought, I don't understand, that terrible, the moment of understanding what the word final means. There's no more conversation to be had. If I could just hear her voice one more time, that lovely, gentle voice of hers, I couldn't hear it, and I didn't understand about the conversation. And then as the months pass, there is a little thread of the conversation that you can, if you can find it and pull on it, you begin to hear her voice again. Not exactly, but when I returned to England, although it was for the inquest, for the first time I just started to hear her voice again. So we have started to have a conversation again.
That's how your book starts, with her sort of staying with you.
Yeah, and I started talking to her, and I did this funny thing of lying. I don't know if you do this, but I love lying in the ocean with my head back anyway. It's something I like to have a float. Tony's always saying, come on, let's go. We've got to, it's time to get out. It's cold, or there's a shark, or, it's getting sharky time, or whatever, there's a meal, there's something to go to. And I always like a little bit of extra time to float. So head back, ears under the water, so that you can't hear anything except that great echoey sound of the ocean.
Oh, that scares the crap out of me.
So I love that because I don't believe in sharks. So
you don't believe in sharks,
that's right?
Christmas. I should have thought of that.
Easter bunny,
sharks.
Got
it.
I believe in Christmas. Just Father Christmas, that thing. So I've always loved that sort of disembodied feeling of floating in the ocean, and so I used my floating time and I would say to Tony, no, I'm not coming out. I need to float a bit more. It sounds so nutty, doesn't it? And in the floating, I talked to her. So I put my head right back and I talked to her about all sorts of things. And because the ocean in Australia, God bless, is so enormous, because you can talk in the ocean or in the local creek without anybody being anywhere near you, I could talk out loud. You can't do that in a city. And at home, I haven't reached the point where I can chat to her in the house. But in the ocean, I talk to her all through the summer.
I was thinking about the scene you described and the visceral nature of your grief. Do you think that there's something about when a parent dies, and I've seen this in a lot of my friends who have experienced it, you become a child again?
Yes. So it's so complicated. I'm complicated, that's not really the right word, but it's
layered.
It's dual. That's right.
Yeah.
More than dual. There's lots of things going on at once. So I felt like you are absolutely the child, and it makes you want to say, as I did in the creek, it makes you want to say, well, it made me want to use the words of the child, mummy. When my father died, I wanted to say daddy, I want my mummy back, which is a crazy thing for an adult to say, really. But you reoccupy the language of the child at the same time as becoming like their parents. So it's all right, you're free to go, rest, be peaceful. So you are child and mother to your parents at the same time, which is just extraordinary.
One of the things I found most beautiful about this story was your husband Tony's role, just as he's very much a side character, but just the gentleness with which he accompanies you along this path. And it's literally a path, because you have to go from Australia to the UK after you hear the news, and you talk about how you write about how you were just in a fog, and he sort of carefully escorted you through the airport because the world was just too much.
Yes. So
he was very protective of you.
He did that from the moment that the call came through and all the way through. He had his father had just died. It's not as simple as my grief was simpler in a way, but he understood that I couldn't hit hard objects. So walking through the airport, he just made sure that that I didn't hit bureaucracy or any hard pointed objects or foolish people. So he just put a little force field around me so that I didn't have to bump into anything or anyone.
What was it like walking back into your mum's house?
That takes my breath away. That is so strange. And I should say that I have one of the things I felt early on writing the book and in the consideration of it was, did I have the right to write it? My story is so simple there are so many more complex, sadder, more tragic losses in the world. What right did I have to do it? And then understood that this is something that for which there is no comparison. You lose something, it's profound, and it's all right that it's simple, and that's enough, and you don't have to compare yourself to the many greater losses. So, but I just preface that by saying I understand that many people have been through this, and they go through it in circumstances that are a great deal more trying than this. But the house, her home, because she created a perfect house, really. It was quiet, and it was, which is again so one of the many hundreds of things I hadn't understood, that every little thing in her house was perfectly placed. So it had a sort of spell in it, her house, like her mother's house had. And I'm too, I think, chaotic to create that. I'm too messy, and things aren't in the same place every day, whereas for her she had created, there was a sort of spell. So arriving at her house and her not being there was the strangest feeling of all. So Anthony answered the door, and he and I knew we couldn't speak in that moment, but it was so wrong. The idea that we were there and she wasn't, and then there's all of those terrible little signals, her slippers, she had a copy of The Spectator under her pillow, little notes on she'd left because she'd gone to hospital expecting to return. So, of course, what you've got is a life arrested. The fridge is full. But just that's the spell, the unbroken spell of her, so strong in the house. Their energy, which, whatever that is, it's real and it's there. And it made me very tentative in moving around the house, so not wanting to move things. So when the children arrived, mine and my brothers, even though their energy, it's essential that then you bring youth in, and they are, of course, about next. They bring with them that great wind of energy, that great billowing of energy that young people have. You need that. But I was terribly worried that they'd move the furniture, or when they would sort of, drag the cushions onto the floor, I'd flinch because my mother was quite formal, and it was a sort of bit desecrating in a way. They were good, so it was fine, but I wanted everything to be in the right place.
You felt hypersensitive.
Hypersensitive. Don't put the fork in the wrong drawer.
And how much of your journalistic, investigative instincts kicked in? At what point did they kick in and you wanted to know what happened?
Well, I did want to know. So I knew when we landed that there was, because we left very quickly. So I knew when we landed that the body hadn't been released from the hospital, that was in the morgue. So that was the first really confronting thing. Are you going to go to the morgue? Because I'm not, for all the horror of the work that the things that I see, I'm actually rather my mind's eye is a bit of a fragile thing, and I'm careful about not seeing things, even though it's quite hard to explain, but I don't avert my eyes from the important things in a story, but I'm careful to protect my mind's eye from images that will haunt me, because I know they will. I know that my visual imagination plays merry hell with me. So seeing her in a morgue was a terrible prospect, and something I even considered not doing. I knew I had to.
Why did you have to?
Because, so I thought, if you don't, you'll never understand that she's dead. If you don't see her dead, you don't understand. There's a missing link. Now, this isn't the case for everybody. My uncle, her twin brother, didn't want to see her there. But mostly it was responsibility. I felt I needed to go and for them,
as part of the process.
Yes, that to see that she was
to pay witness
and make sure she was being taken care of, and make sure that people were being gentle with her. When my father died, I wanted to do everything. So I wanted to, because we'd looked after him, I wanted to carry his body down the stairs. I actually wanted to sort of stuff him and put him in a chair in the sitting room. I sort of understood where taxidermy comes in, that people do that. I sort of got it.
Why? What
so because you do it better. So whatever you do, you're going to do it with such absolute gentleness and love. And it's tender. When somebody dies, you can be tender with them.
Because he was a person to you, yes, not just a body.
And it's not that people are unkind, or funeral directors are unkind or clumsy, or people in hospital are. They're also tender, but it's obviously not the same tenderness. So I wanted to drive the hearse. I wanted to dig the grave. I wanted to do absolutely everything.
And did you?
I did.
How'd you go with that?
I obviously I let go some of those tasks, but I was pretty cross. I heard them kind of clunking down the stairs, and I thought I wouldn't have bumped into the
Balustrade.
Although if I had, my brother and I would have laughed, so that would have been okay.
But you would have been allowed to laugh.
We were allowed to laugh, that's right. So I knew I had to go. I had to see her there, but I also knew it was going to be I knew it was going to be terrible. So we knew that she hadn't been released, and it took some time before they announced an inquest. So we were just in limbo. But I did want to know. I had started asking what happened, but you have to be very careful around this moment, because my desire to know things was not matched by everybody else. And so I was just being a bit careful in pushing my question. Everyone feels it differently.
You've seen a lot of bodies in your time as a reporter. Oh, you've seen your father, obviously.
Yes. This was much worse. This was so much worse because we had taken him in moments from, still compos mentis to losing consciousness to those long rattly breaths waiting for the next one to come. We'd done that. So it's slow. It's the best way to have someone die, because then your brain and your mind and your heart can adjust in moments, in stages. So this was, in a horrible place, in this low-slung 1950s building with a chimney out the back. Just the signposts in the hospital, maternity ward this way, morgue that way, such is life. But everything about that, my whole being was in revolt. I was screaming not to be there. Everything about it was ugly and functional. And that's one of the, I was as afraid of functional ugliness as I was of gruesome. It was as much the notion that this is just another name on a form. When you see your mother's name on a form in a hospital, as I did when I was preparing for the inquest, that's, just to accept. Of course, they're just another name to be moved through the system. So I was as afraid of the system and its ugliness and its inherent ugliness as I was of something wrong.
Because it's that depersonalisation, isn't it?
Exactly.
So how did things play out from there in terms of the inquest? Why even was there an inquest?
So we had this moment where, as I said, the thing about young people is they bring this great sort of billowing energy, and Lucian had arrived and we went to a pub. This is in the sort of limbo time where we're waiting to hear what's happening. And it was the first moment where we sat outside, we had a drink, and there was I took a photograph. It was the first time I'd taken a picture since we'd arrived. And there was a little light moment. And then the coroner called to say there was going to be an inquest, and out goes the light. Actually, my brother and Lucian were playing pool on an outside pool table under the covered in chestnuts. So we were having a light moment, and then we just rested the pool cues.
What had you been
told
table about her death until that point?
It was all very ordinary. She'd fallen over, and she wasn't a faller overer, but she had fallen over, and she'd spent. This was not a detail that I like to dwell on at the time, but she'd fallen over in the daytime and woke in the night. So obviously she'd been out for some time, and the thought of her alone on the floor was terrible. And she'd gone to hospital because she'd broken her hip. Now, because every other person has a hip replacement, lots and lots of people, quite young, our contemporaries, that people are having hip replacements. It didn't seem to be such a gigantic deal, but she's 80, so I've learned more about it since.
And nobody called you?
And nobody called us. So the only thing the hospital was prepared to apologise for was not calling, and because that was the simple thing they could apologise for. It was so wrong. Well, I should say that's during the operation, because what happened is she had a pulmonary embolism during the operation.
Which is an air bubble in her lungs?
It's a blood clot. So, deep vein thrombosis, if you get off that plane from London and you feel funny, you need to go to the doctor because you might have DVT. So she had an embolism, and they carried on with the operation, and then it was just your classic series of cock-ups, really. I mean, nothing may have made a difference. In the end, we had to arrive at a point where it is altogether possible that nothing would have made a difference, but boy, they didn't give her the chance. So they put her in a recovery ward because ICU was full. So there she was alone, harried staff, and in the notes from the hospital, one of the worst phrases of all was her last words were, "I'm clammy and cold." So she was not well, and she was in the wrong place, not being not being properly cared for. So, and the hospital didn't ring to say that anything had happened. And it's possible, so at least my brother's children could have got there and been with her when she died, because it took a long time for her to die.
What was it that killed her?
So she had a heart attack in the end. So the embolism caused a massive heart attack, but lots and lots of things had gone wrong between the operation and then. But at the time we didn't know that. We just knew that that something had gone wrong in the hospital, and there was an inquest. An inquest is a big, they can be short, but it's a big, ugly. What did I say about being afraid of sort of bureaucracy and function in the system? There is a system word. We're going to have an inquest.
What is an inquest? And why do you have an inquest? I mean, people die all the time.
Yeah.
People die in hospitals, presumably all the time. She was 80.
Yes.
She'd had a good run.
Yes.
Using those awful terms and that awful idea, it's not like she'd been found in the street.
No,
it's
that's
not
right.
like it was unexplained. She'd had an operation. They knew what it was.
Yes.
Why an inquest?
Because there wasn't, the cause of death was unclear. Was there something that had contributed to it? So even there had to be a post-mortem to discover the cause of death. And then because she'd come in for a hip replacement, you're not supposed to die. So what had happened? And what they found was the system was full of holes. Might not have made a difference, but the system was full of holes. So, but just having that word inquest, and then in what you learn and this is our problem with confronting bureaucracy, is that it sounds gentle. They make all the right sounds to begin with, but you push back at all, and the system closes in, shuts down, draws up the drawbridge, and you become the enemy. And it happens amazingly quickly, which it did.
Because you were asking questions on her behalf as her family.
Yes.
You described the inquest, which happened how long after she died?
So that was in December. So
a few months after she died. She died in September of 2017.
Last year. Yeah.
The Sarah that you describe in that, is it a courtroom?
Yes, it's a courtroom.
Of which you've been in countless, hundreds, was not a Sarah that I recognised. I've known you for a long time, and I've known your work for much longer. And describe how you felt, and because you've been in many inquests.
So and I'd just been through a very long inquest in Sydney. So having the coroner the coroner's office be very patronising with me about what inquests were.
Did they know what they were dealing with?
They weren't. They were just dealing with a grieving relative. But again, it's just my problem is insincerity. Be straight with me. Don't be terribly, terribly sorry and sympathetic, and then try and shut me down. So they tried to push it off to be just a paper inquest, where the coroner looks at the paperwork and has a verdict. And the hospital had by that time launched an investigation of its own, and the coroner didn't know that, so we had to tell them, and I was pushing back. In the courtroom, in the coroner's court, I was two people at the same time. So I was able at some parts of it to get on track as here is four corners in the room.
Because you talked about, you had a notepad, Tony was sitting behind you, he was making notes, he handed you his notes, and they were identical.
They were identical. It was very, I did laugh. But at the same time, then it's your mother. So it was such a strange combination. And I had this funny moment where this great phalanx of lawyers came in from the hospital trust and took up their table. And then I looked down at myself, and what had happened the night before the inquest was the heating. We'd gone back to my mother's house, and the heating had broken down. And you forget, England is so cold. I'd forgotten how cold England is in the winter.
You said it was like 0 degrees in the house.
It was 0 degrees in the house. So we walked in, and obviously something was wrong. And the boiler had broken down because, houses will take their revenge on you if you leave them empty. And the house did punish us. So we spent the night. We went scrabbling through my mother's cupboards and found, pink mohair scarves and hats. And we walked around the house, all of us, in hats and scarves, wearing doonas. And my brother wore a hat so that when he went to the inquest, he had a great big crease on his forehead like he'd just had a lobotomy. He looked really, really peculiar. And seated next to him, me, I had in the morning, because we'd buried my mother's ashes in the morning, so it was a right old day. Oh. And I was so cold that I'd taken a jumper of hers, but I hadn't noticed that it was obviously a gardening jumper because she was very meticulous, but it had great big holes in the elbow. So I had 2 jumpers on, and I was sitting with these, and the top one it was too big for me, and it had great big undarned holes in it. So I really looked like the picture of a pathetic grieving, in the nicest sense of the word, a sad grieving relative. And I do remember thinking, you think that, go ahead.
Yeah, I loved what you said. You realised in that moment it gave you an advantage because they'd underestimate you.
Yeah. So off we went.
Little do they know they have, Australia's 2 top journalists sitting in the courtroom.
It's just the system. It's just what we do. It's about holding the system to account. Doesn't mean that you have great revelations, but it means that when they try and snow you, we know what snow sounds like when it's to snow you, to try and get you to just accept their version, which is what it was all about.
The stakes of an inquest also, it was about if the hospital were found to be at fault,
yes,
you could have sued them.
That's right. So that's why they
had all the lawyers.
And that's what they're worried about. And the coroner said, because we elected not to have lawyers, and the coroner said, but have you had legal advice? And you could tell, we could tell that there was this, it was obvious that that's what they were worried about all the time. So they had come to a conclusion that while they were prepared to admit that the care wasn't good, nothing would have made a difference. And the whole inquest was about them getting the coroner to accept that, because if she accepted that and delivered what's called a short sentence verdict, we can't sue, game over. Now, we were never going to sue, but nor was I going to let them get to a sort of they wanted it to be called natural causes. They wanted that to be and that wasn't the cause of the death. So the one thing I didn't want was to end up at that point, and that's where they wanted to end up so that they could be sure we couldn't come back again.
So you didn't want to sue. What were you hoping to achieve?
Exactly what my mother would have wanted, because quite a few friends of mine said, you shouldn't go. Why are you going? She wouldn't want you to go. And I thought, well, you're completely wrong about that. But she would want me to go. She would want me to see if we could insist that there were no lies told, that the bureaucratic language was kept under control, that they apologised, and it was a sort of honest process. She would want me to go into bat for her, actually, not in a sort of for me selfish way, but that's the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. And it was interesting because my uncle, who was her twin brother, to whom she was very close, was very reluctant for us to engage in any of this. Sort of none of this would make a difference. So there was a little bit of sort of tension between in the family about my absolute certainty that we were going to do this.
And what did the inquest find?
So there was a great sort of Perry Mason moment right at the end. So the hospital lawyers overreached themselves and tried to persuade the coroner to deliver a natural causes verdict, and he just went too far. And I had one of those it was a true Four Corners moment. He went too far. He made a mistake. We heard him. I went back to the evidence at the beginning, which was the very first person who gave evidence was the person who'd done the post-mortem. And in that moment, I can tell you my brain was nuts. It was flying around the room like a banshee. I did not have my brain under control, but I remembered that he had said, the chap who'd done the post-mortem had said something that left the question open about when the embolism had occurred. And so I sort of got to my feet, sort of being Rumpole of the Bailey, and Madam, I put it to you. And used their language,
Yes.
Just because at the beginning she'd very patronisingly explained that, with this we can only consider questions that go to the cause of death. So I repeated that about 25 times, and said that really just pointed out that the hospital lawyer had wildly overstated the case, and what he was asking of the coroner was quite wrong and not found in the evidence. And she said, I was minded to give a short sentence verdict, and I'm now changing my mind. I'm going to go away and come back and give what's called a narrative verdict. And that's important because it means the hospital has to change its protocol. It has to change the way it behaves towards people like my mother. So I've heard for years people say they want inquests because they don't want it to happen to other people. And I really understand that now, that actually, because of course it just gives some small meaning to sadness. But it is that thing. Systems shut down when they're under attack or they feel like they've made a mistake and they're trying to cover it up. They were understaffed. There were all sorts of things that were wrong and they didn't want those things to come out, and they did. So in that moment, it's a victory, and it all happened very fast. And my brother said, what just happened? I said, I'll explain in a minute when we get back outside, because it turned around very quickly. And then it's my mother again and the coroner. We all have to stand up, and she says, in the death of Marjorie Ferguson, and suddenly it's me again. It's her again. This is not television. This is not Four Corners. This is me. And I had to absolutely pull every piece of me together, because in that moment I could have just dropped to the floor. So I had to gather every bit of my life and her life to stand up as straight as I could and to make my back as rigid as I could to get through that moment. And then you leave and it's darkness, and it was 2 days before Christmas, and the staff wanted to get home because it was the end of the year, and the doors close behind you and the lights go off and she's dead.
Did it feel like losing her again?
That just the I'm going to make up a word, the endiness of it. You know, it's for all the drama,
because it's not closure.
No, there's
people like to talk about closure.
Yeah, and of course it's not available.
Yeah.
What's available is time and the magic and the softening of time. There is no closure. It's not as simple as that. That word is not a good word, I think, because it suggests to people that it's available to you at a moment when it's not. You can't have it until time has done its thing.
What were the other moments that you remember when it really just felt like, I've lost her again, I've lost her again?
It's the every time. So the being in the house, everything about being in the house and her garden. So she was a garden maker. She made, and so much I didn't understand. We found this box of photos in the house that were pretty sort of snappy snaps, not great photos. And they were of bare garden beds, and we put them away again because we were looking for what we thought were more interesting photos. And then we realised that these were boxes of photos of all the gardens she'd built, because she was a wonderful gardener. It's the every moment that because she was funny. So all of our conversations virtually all of them were funny and silly. And it's that moment of turning. This is the thing about not having parents. Some people describe it as losing the roof. For me, it's like losing the behind. So it's that instinct when something happens, and I could only really share with her the kind of most ridiculous things about life, where I am at my most foolish, or the silliest thing, or the most pompous thing, or the most daft person. She's the one who loved all of that.
Because she had your back more than anyone in the world.
That's right. So you turn around in your mind to share that, and there's no one to share it with. That connection, the vertical connection, has gone. You have all of the horizontal left. I have my brother. My brother is still there. Obviously, my family is still there, but everything that is up or behind, those sort of prepositional relationships, that's gone, and you miss it so much. It's true that you can talk again, but that connection is lost, and that person with whom you can say everything and anything and laugh your head off is gone.
And yet there's so much to be done. You had to pack up the house, presumably.
No, we haven't done that yet.
It's still sitting there.
We're still sitting there. We started, but when I went back, I was in London. No, that was sort of for the inquest. We opened one drawer and took some forks out, and I just put them back again. It's like, oh no, I can't do it. I mean, sometimes you have to, but we just left it. We couldn't. The spell is still unbroken. When I left, I kissed all the walls, because that's what Africans do. They kiss the walls of the house, and a lot of my family's life was spent in Africa, so it's a thing. And the spell, she hasn't left. She hasn't quite left it yet.
Do you feel drawn
She's
back
leaving.
there?
Yes, I mean, but on we go. So I know that it has to go, and it just reminds you, live light. Tread lightly on this earth. Don't weigh yourself down with too many things. Live with the people, not with the things, because they're all for nothing. They're all going to go.
Do you remember the last? I mean, of course you do. But the last time you saw her and the last time you spoke?
Yeah, the last time. This is such a funny story. I'll tell you, because it's such a silly story. So we were visiting her, and luckily, thank the Lord, we had been to see her in the summer, only for a few days, because we arrived in England and Tony's father died, so we turned around and went back again. But we did stay for a couple, because I hadn't seen her for a while, so we stayed for a few days before we came back to Australia. And we went for a drive up the coast. And when I was a child, we used to swim on that coast, and this is the North Sea, so this is not
Chilly.
Bondi. chili, pebbles, chili, and English people with whelks and whatever else.
What's a whelk?
It's a mollusk, whatever weird behaviour the English have at the seaside, because it's the seaside. And it was summer and it was warm and the water was sort of green, looked like it had come sort of via a nuclear plant, but it's it's the North Sea. And so I went swimming in my undies. And I happened to have, very unusually for me, I happened to have got my underwear in quite a sorted mode, and I was in my matching, no less. Just what you want. Fancy. Red. I mean, really. And in Aldeburgh, in England, which is where they have a very fine classical music concert, it's quite an interesting place. But it's not a place where people go swimming in their red matching undies. And Lucian was with me. Can you imagine? And I just stripped down because I'm now Australian and I don't care. And I dived into the green waters, freezing waters, and I went for a swim in my red undies. And I just thought, I wouldn't do that in Australia because there'd be someone with,
Daily Mail.
Hello. And we came back.
I'd click on that.
So would I. And I can just remember when I saw your son this morning, I was just thinking about, how I'm sure he's been through lots of moments like that with you of kind of, oh my God,
only
that's
a million.
my mother. And Lucian just, as if I wasn't there, he just sort of,
Yeah, and it's funny, you just have absolutely no concern in front of your child. Yeah, you're unembarrassable.
What's to be embarrassed about? So and I just remember going back and telling my mother about swimming in my red undies at Aldeburgh, which is, everything about that is wrong. Aldeburgh is sort of, it is kind of, it's sort of posh because it's has this, people go there to live, to lead interesting lives and think about poetry and classical music, and it's not a place for red undie swimming. So we just laugh like drains. I came back and said, what did you do? Did you have a nice lunch? Yes, but I went for a swim. But did you take your swimming costume? Your bathers? No, I went in my undies, and she was just like, she used to giggle. She had the best giggle, so we just laughed like drains. And she said, oh my God, it's going to be in the East Anglian Daily Times tomorrow. So that's one of the last funniest conversations we had face to face.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I hope your conversation with her continues.
Thank you. And thank you for reading it.
It's a beautiful book. It's such a beautiful book. You made me cry. I never cry when I'm interviewing people. Bet you don't cry when you're interviewing people. Do you ever?
I'm sure I have.
Well, if that doesn't make you want to call your mother, if you are fortunate enough to have the kind of relationship with your mother, and if she's still in your life and if she's still alive, that you can pick up the phone or text and speak to her. I was fortunate enough to have my mum already coming over for dinner the night that we recorded this interview, and I sort of clung to her, and then I gave her Sarah's book, which she took home, and then she was texting me saying that she was crying or she read it too. So it just affected me in such a way, and it really resonated what Sarah said at the start, in that she thought, why do I have permission to write this book? And my story isn't particularly tragic, and there are people who've lost their loved ones in far more arduous and traumatic circumstances. And I've interviewed people who have far more arduous and traumatic stories, and yet there was something about the way Sarah told it and wrote it, and perhaps how everybody has a very, very deep connection to their mother, no matter how good or bad their relationship is or was, and to motherhood itself, that just really cut through all my defences and got straight to the crying place. You can buy Sarah's book at any good bookstore. It's one of those small books. So Lee Sales has written one called On Doubt. Nikki Gemmel's recently released one called On Quiet. Blanche Dalpuge, who I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, has written one on lust and longing. They're almost like essays. So they're about 5,000 words or 10,000. No, they're 10,000 words, I think. They only take, half an hour to read. They're beautiful to get for yourself or to get for someone as a gift. I highly, highly recommend them. We've got a few of them at apple.co/Mamamia that you can look at. And you can find them usually near the front counter at any bookstore. No Filter is produced by Liza Ratliff, who also got a little bit teary in that interview. I'm Mia Friedman, and I will see you on our homepage, mamamia.com.au.